Hey everyone, welcome to another video of Well-Tuned Musician with me, Alex. First of all, I should say I was really glad with the reception of my last video that dealt with the issue of how we've come to treat the word tension in the music world. It seems like I really hit something there that many of us have been ruminating silently. So, for those of you who haven't watched it, let me share this analogy to serve as a recap. In order to tune a string properly, you don't want it to be either completely relaxed nor too tense. You want just the right amount of tension so that the string can serve its purpose for producing a certain tone. Now imagine having a piano technician come into your home and telling him, I want you to tune my piano, but the only thing you're allowed to do to get that done is to loosen the strings. You can't apply more tension to them. So how far do you think that technician could go in his work? When you think about it, muscles are like bundles of strings, where the strings are in that case muscle fibers. The right tension for a muscle is what we call an optimal muscle tone. Yeah, like the tone of a sound. Now, isn't that an interesting coincidence? In any case, sometimes you want to tighten those fibers, sometimes you want to loosen them to adjust for life's demands. Okay, enough with the recap. So I've been thinking about making something like a monthly Q&A where I would answer a bunch of your questions. First, I have to say I feel blessed by those questions and your participation in this project for musicians' health. I will absolutely answer all of your questions in the not too distant future, but I feel like I have to lay out something else first before I can tackle them. So here is a list of all the subjects you've asked me to speak to thus far. Now, what I've realized is that there is a big chunk of those that we could answer quite well using a certain framework. The thing is, if I don't explain that framework first and take the time to clarify the terms, there is a chance I might lose many of you in the process and not get my points across. Frameworks are extremely useful to connect ideas and concepts together, while at the same time distinguishing them to avoid confusion. There is a whole bunch of terminology you will hear when it comes to physical health, and sometimes certain words will be used differently across different domains, something that can create a lot of confusion. The solution to this is to first make sure we define terms properly so we're all on the same page. Now, exposing a coherent framework takes some time, so this will be a longer video. But if you do take the time to listen, I can assure you, you will gain very useful knowledge that will help you in answering a whole array of common questions related to musculoskeletal health. There will also be a TLDL/recap at the end for those of you who don't feel like they have the time for this nearly half-hour video. So, the framework I'm going to expose you to is definitely not unique to osteopathy, and I've made sure to use concepts that are as universal as possible across domains. When they're not, I will make sure to tell you about the origin of their use. So, I'm going to contradict myself a little bit here and tell you that I'm actually going to answer one question from the comments in the previous videos. There is a reason for that though, so hang in there. It's the question of Marino Oliveira 4204. Hope I got that right. So he said, hey, great hypermobility in musicians. Thanks a lot. Well, thanks to you, sir. And I should mention, I found some really cool guitar playing on this gentleman's channel. You can check that out. So the question of hypermobility is one of particular interest for our purpose here. And the reason for that is that in order to properly explain it, I'm going to have to go through a whole bunch of other concepts that will precisely allow me to lay out that framework I've been telling you about. So here is a list of the terms we're going to be defining. They will be included as chapters under this video. So first, we have to talk about range of motion. In a reduced sense, range of motion is defined as the extent to which a joint can be moved. Simple enough, right? We usually measure that motion in terms of angles, and it is of particular interest to almost anyone involved in some form of physical therapy, since it allows for objective measurements, not only of problems in the joints, but also of progress through the course of treatments of those joints. Now, it is very important to distinguish two types of range of motion: passive range of motion and active range of motion. We abbreviate these terms as PROM for passive range of motion and AROM for active range of motion. This distinction will be crucial to understand hypermobility later on, so make sure you master it. Passive range of motion is the motion any part of your body can go through with the use of an external force. That external force could be gravity, but it could also be something like the hand of a therapist manipulating your limb. Active range of motion is the motion that a body part can go through on its own, that is through the use of your muscles. Make sure this is super clear in your mind. Passive range of motion happens, well, passively because of an external force, whereas active range of motion happens with the subject being active, using his own muscles to move his limbs through space. We can symbolize these two things with a stripe. The green stripe here represents your passive range of motion, while the blue stripe represents your active range of motion. Now, there are a couple of things we should note about this schematic. First, the fact that the PROM is wider than the AROM. That is because normally your passive range of motion is supposed to exceed your active range of motion, at least a little. For instance, as a therapist, I should be able to push your limb beyond what it can reach when you are the one moving it. Second, this schematic is used to represent one joint, and also just one pair of motions within that joint. Here I'm using the example of the wrist going from full flexion to full extension. These things should be properly labeled. If I want to represent more than two motions for a single joint in a united schematic, then I'm going to use a circle instead, with multiple lines replacing the stripe I used earlier. Each line represents one pair of motion. These schematics are central to our framework and we'll be using them quite a bit. Okay, now let's turn ourselves to a couple observations about the concepts of passive and active range of motion. When we hear the word flexibility, oftentimes the first thing that comes to mind is the idea of someone who can execute, let's say, a toe reach standing up, or who can adopt a perfect lotus position. Now, between the active and passive range of motion, which one of the two is used most in both cases? The answer would be mostly passive range of motion, because external forces were probably used to reach and maintain those positions. In those examples we used, the person performing a toe reach can rely a lot on gravity to assume her stance, while the person in the lotus position has most likely arranged her legs in this fashion, using her hands to take and place them. So passive range of motion is really what we have in mind when we think of flexibility. This association should be clear in your mind. Now, flexibility and PROM aren't exactly the same, but there is definitely a lot of overlap between them, something that we can symbolize with this Venn diagram here. Now, a very important point here is that in order to display a lot of passive range of motion, one technically doesn't need to have much strength, since an external force is doing the work of moving their body parts for them and holding them there. This aspect will be crucial for later. Okay, now let's go back to the idea of active range of motion, or AROM for short. We've said that AROM meant we were using your own muscles to move your body parts around. So this implies a base level of strength. I'll say it again. Active range of motion, or AROM, implies a base level of strength, since it is your own muscles which move your body parts through whichever range of motion you're going through. Remember in our last video about tension, we mentioned that violinist and pedagogue Grigory Kalinowski deplored the fact that many of his students couldn't even lift their arm above a 90-degree angle. Now, you can understand that in a way, what he deplores is a lack of AROM on their part, and that this lack of AROM also probably implies a lack of strength. So let's go back to our stripe schematic here. So AROM is represented with the color blue, PROM with the color green. We said earlier that PROM is usually wider than AROM. This means there is a difference between the two on both ends of the stripe. This is a gap that matters a lot for what we're about to explain. Now, some people are naturally born with a lot of P-ROM or flexibility. These people tend to have a greater gap between their passive and active range of motion. You're not born with a proportionate amount of A-ROM compared to P-ROM. This is something that has to be learned. Some people will fill that gap, but many won't. You may have thought in the past, maybe going into a yoga class, oh, how lucky are these folks who are so naturally flexible, right? Actually, there is a trend in the scientific literature that shows that a lot of natural flexibility tends to be at best a neutral thing, or at worst, an increase for injury risks in your joints and ligaments. See our sources on that in the description. In any case, it is not beneficial for injury prevention to have naturally very loose joints. Let's take a look at why that could be the case. Let's go back to this gap between active and passive range of motion. Now, to a certain extent, we could say that your active range of motion is nearly synonymous with control, or at least that those two things are closely related. It makes sense, right? The range of motion that you can go through with your own muscles is the range of motion that you control. So let's display this overlap between these concepts in another Venn diagram here to illustrate that point. This is important, so maybe pause the video and take a moment to reflect on that if that isn't clear to you. Good. So going back to this pair of motion schematic, it's now logical to understand that this gap between active and passive range of motion really represents a zone of space that you don't control. Now, generally, a lack of control in your motions tend to be associated with greater injury risks for both for repetitive motions, as in the case with musicians, and or motions that involve bearing a lot of weight. Perhaps you can now see why a greater gap between your P-ROM and your A-ROM might be problematic. A bigger gap means a greater zone that we don't control, hence higher risk for injuries. Now, control isn't just a one or nothing phenomenon. In our graphs, we've oversimplified this, but in reality, you should expect a gradient when it comes to the control we can display over any region. In this graph, the color blue represents control. Note that we usually display more control the closer we are to the center of our range of motion. But there are exceptions, the knee being a prime example where we tend to naturally have more control when we're closer to full extension rather than full flexion. With this in mind, we can now introduce the concept of mobility. Now, some people have equated this concept with the concept of A-ROM, but I think this is a mistake. There is definitely overlap, but to me and from what I've learned over time, mobility is something else. To introduce this, let's first use an approximation and say that mobility is like A-ROM plus an undefined/unlimited amount of strength. If that puzzles you, hang on, we'll explain this further. Another way to put this is to say that mobility is strength that is displayed in the A-ROM of a joint, or just ROM to make things more simple. A more mathematical way to say this would be to say that mobility is strength times ROM. If I had to come up with an index for mobility, that's what I would use. Now, is there a difference between control and mobility? At this point, control and mobility are pretty much the same to me, but that discussion goes beyond the scope of this video. What's not beyond the scope of this video is the difference between A-ROM and mobility. And by now, you may already have an idea of what that could be. So let's explain this a bit further to make sure this is super clear to everyone. So we said that A-ROM required a base level of strength. It's the strength you need to move a limb through space, considering the pull of gravity. But that strength requirement is a 1 or a 0. Either you can move the limb in a given position or you can't. Whereas with mobility, now we're looking at how much strength you can display on top of being able to do that. Could you, for instance, go through your full A-ROM using a 10 pounds weight or a 20 pounds weight, and so on? So there is no theoretical limit to mobility, and so there is no such thing as too much mobility, technically. That's why we said that mobility is ROM plus an undefined/unlimited amount of strength. Think about the greatest athletes in the world who use quite large range of motions for their craft, and know that part of what you see in them is great hypermobility. Okay, now to finally answer our viewer's question, what is hypermobility and how is it relevant in the case of musicians? So at first glance, just looking at the word, it would be easy to think that someone who is hypermobile as a whole, or at least for one joint, is someone who is supermobile, meaning someone who is both super strong and super flexible. You could think that, right? Well, actually, this is absolutely not the way that word is used in medicine and sports sciences. Hypermobile instead means someone who has a lot of flexibility, or pirome, period. Not arome, pirome. Seems contradictory, right? Unfortunately, this is how the nomenclature currently works. So the jargons in different domains have evolved in parallel. These domains not talking all that much to each other or evolving in an asynchronous way. So these kinds of terminology issues can arise and create some confusion. This is why I've insisted so much on explaining mobility in 13 different ways so that there can't be any ambiguity in your mind on this topic. So now that we know that hypermobility is basically just a lot of pirome, means that we've actually already explained why hypermobility could be a problem for many people. So let's simply use this opportunity for a small review. We've said earlier that a lot of pirome, which we now know to be synonymous with hypermobility, will mean for many people a wider difference between arome and pirome, which means a lack of control in a wider zone of the rome. We've said that this lack of control means an increased risk of injury. Another expression that is used by health professionals to describe a lack of control at the joint is joint instability. There are many hypotheses as why an unstable joint or a joint we might not control very well might turn out injured. I'll give you just one. Without proper stability, the tendons and nerves passing through a joint might not align properly with the neighboring joint surfaces like cartilage and bones, causing excess amount of pressure on them. So take this rope here as an illustration. So here, this rope around the sheet of plastic can represent either a tendon or a nerve passing through a joint in their sheet. If I only press it slightly on my knee, it can glide without any issues. But if I press hard here, maintain this pressure, the amount of wear and tear will grow rapidly. So the issue here is about providing enough structure around the nerve or tendon so that it glides free of compression in its sheath rather than pressed against bone and cartilage. This structure, which is made of proper alignments, a new term here, is provided by a well-distributed, well-coordinated amount of strength that is a sufficient muscle tone, or I could even say sufficient and appropriate tension. I just use the word tension in a positive way. Isn't that amazing? Now, I should add that good alignments also provide strength, so this can work both ways. This is what I believe Alexander meant when he talked about positions of mechanical advantage. When you are in the right position with the right alignments, more strength is readily available to you. In the world of fitness, position of mechanical advantage or good alignments usually bears the name good form. Again, there are certainly overlaps between these ideas, but they're not exactly the same either, of course. I'll let you guys reflect on this for now. Tell me about it in the comments. Now, starting with good form or good alignments is probably the best way to go about any movement. But just as is the case in fitness, if you obsess on the technical perfection and don't actually get in there and start muscling up, you might end up with no results at all. The two concepts are intertwined and nourish each other. Good form helps out strength, and strength allows for good form. You need both. In the case of piano playing, maintaining proper alignments or form means you won't be twisting your wrist in weird positions or maintaining your elbow at a funny place in space, either too close or too far away from you. By the way, if you want to know the rules for proper alignments at the piano, I highly suggest a Roberto D'Urso lecture about Taubman technique, which I will link in the description, thanks to the person who linked this to me in a previous video. At the violin, this would mean that your bow arm will be just high enough given the string you're playing on, and that your left hand will respect a general, well-balanced frame when playing. At the guitar, since the person who asked us about hypermobility is a guitarist, but also at the piano and the violin, this means, among other things, that you will, as much as possible, avoid curl finger positions for your left hand at the guitar and violin and for both hands at the piano. Long fingers, which tend to connect with the instrument at their pulp rather than at their tip, are usually recognized as an easier position to play from when it comes to the flexing of the fingers. It should technically allow for more skin surface to connect with the keys or strings, giving us more touch information about what's going on and thus more control over it. That being said, when it comes to all of the correct positioning ideas, there can be no hard rules, only guidelines. So, for instance, in a 1987 recording, Ivo Pogorelic demonstrates a clear example of sustained curl fingers playing in a Bach suite, while displaying a remarkable level of evenness and stability in his control of the musical phrasing. To my knowledge, Pogorelic didn't ever have to take a sustained break from piano playing because of an injury, at least not in the decade following that recording, so we have to account for that fact. Nuances need to be added to the curl versus long fingers debate as to any positioning rule, and we will certainly discuss this more in the future. Now, bear in mind that straying away from general recommendations can pose a difficulty, but that very few challenges are insurmountable to the human body when the mobility of your limbs is sufficient. That is my general stance for now, at least. Remember that by mobility, we are talking about a combination of flexibility and strength, not just flexibility. Now, just as we said earlier, some people are naturally more flexible than others. This is largely determined by genetics, and there is not much you can do about it. We could say that they are generally hypermobile. When that seems to be creating issues like pain in many joints for those people, doctors have come to call this generalized hypermobility syndrome. I'm not saying you're condemned to having joint issues if you're very flexible, just that there is a chance that you may have to pay closer attention than average to making sure you have enough strength in your muscles to create enough stability to make up for it. I like to use this analogy for that. It's like going through a Zelda temple with 9 hearts rather than 12. You can still pass it in both cases as long as you master its ins and outs sufficiently. Mistakes are just a bit less forgiving. Gosh, I really hope I'll never have to update that reference. Ever. It's also important you realize that you don't have to be naturally very flexible to develop hypermobility related problems. You can develop localized hypermobility, that is, in a single joint, for instance, and even in a single direction that can lead to problems at your instruments. Okay, so let's look at what that could look like at the piano. So let's imagine I'm being a bit lazy with my wrist and forearm recently when playing. And every time I press either my index or my pinky in the piano, I let my wrist deviate in a funny twisted way towards its end range of motion. Now, funnily enough, when I do that, I am in a sense performing a repeated intermittent stretch in that direction for my wrist, meaning my soft tissues like ligaments, capsules, and fascia are getting extended. In sports sciences terms, doing this would be considered something akin to a ballistic stretching of a joint. We can represent that on our paramotion schematic with an arrow pointing in the direction of the push. Once the stretching is done, the afforded P-rome is now bigger, something we can represent with a line that goes across the limit defining a normal flexibility or P-rome. Something else to consider is that this kind of P-rome, this kind of hypermobility, tends to create hypomobility, so not enough mobility elsewhere, for either the same joint or in other adjacent joints. The important thing to remember now is that a bigger P-rome, especially if achieved passively like is the case here, means a wider zone we don't control where there is potential instability. I say this is being achieved passively for the wrist because the wrist is only receiving the push which comes from the arm in that case. It is not itself doing the push, so it's passive, right? I personally like to say about that way of twisting my joint that I am, quote unquote, pushing or leaning on my ligaments. So this is one of the soft rules for injury prevention in anything. Don't lean into your ligaments for stability. Rely on your muscles instead. So how do we prevent localized hypermobility? Allow your wrist to have just enough muscle activity, yes, enough tension to maintain proper alignments. Don't overdo it and use the necessary tools like going in and out of the keyboard with a forearm and hand to play all the notes while avoiding twisting your wrist. Same goes with any other instruments which have their own ergonomics involved, but the principle remains the same. Now, if the localized hypermobility is there, how do we offset its effects? How do we reverse it? First off, the same strategies used to prevent it might very well do the job for allowing you to undo its effects over time. That being said, there are other things you can do, but that will be a topic for future videos. Okay, now I hope this answered our viewers' question about hypermobility. Thanks again for your question, sir. Now, let me finish this video with an emphasis on this point. We've said earlier that strength helps in providing structure and alignment for our joints and tendons, right? You can verify this connection between strength and alignments for yourself today at your instrument. Try maintaining perfect alignments between head, trunk, arm, forearm, wrists, and fingers while playing a piece of moderate difficulty at a moderate speed and volume without using any excess tension. If you can do that, good for you. You're probably past a decent level of mastery. Now try doing the same thing while playing a very difficult passage at high speed, volume, and evenness. All of that effortlessly. If you can do that, that means you're already past the stage where you have to make a conscious effort, place a conscious tension, and adjust your muscle tone for the activity you are performing. You are already fit to the requirements of your instrument. But know that this is not what I would expect of most musicians, even quite advanced ones actually. Most people need some amount of strengthening of their arms, forearms, and hands, and even their trunk in order to improve at their instrument and prevent injury. And I'm not even talking about warm-up phase here, so just a general rule. So when you master something, you are fit to the task at hand. But in order to become fit to a task, to be able to go effortlessly about it, first, you have to train at it and for it. And training your muscles means that some tension will be required, just like it is for any exercise you want to become good at. Once the strength or tone is built, now your execution can be effortless. In that order, there are stages to becoming fit to something, and that includes all instruments too. Right now, because I am an amateur violinist, not a pro, I need to daily actively sculpt my hands and forearms musculature for the actions required by the violin specifically. Training is specific. That's the first principle of kinesiology. Although transfers between disciplines are existing, obviously. Having trained for the piano in the past, I may have a head start compared to other people when it comes to my hands and forearms musculature. But I'm not done with the strengthening phase yet for violin. As days go by, I realize I need to do that conscious tensioning and sculpting less and less, but I keep finding positions where I need to review or deepen this aspect of my playing at least a little bit. So eventually, I might find myself not in need of much added tension at all to play the pieces I want to play, but that won't change the fact that I had to go through a strengthening phase at some point and may have to review it if I get away from my instrument for a long stretch of time, for instance. Okay, so what's the TLDL of all of this? Let's do a recap. We saw that range of motion, or roam, is the extent to which a joint can be moved. If you measure roam by using an external force to the joint, like gravity or the hand of a therapist moving your limb, it's passive range of motion, or P-roam. If you measure it by using your own muscles, it's active range of motion, or A-roam. There is a gap between A-roam and P-roam, P-roam being normally wider than A-roam. This gap means potentially less control over your motions in those zones. The wider the gap, the less control you may have. Mobility is the combination of strength and P-roam, or strength and flexibility. It is not the same as A-roam, but still related. It is nearly synonymous with control. Hypermobility simply means you have a lot of P-roam. That's it. Hypermobility can increase the risk of instability, which can increase the risk of injuries. This also relates to the issue of lack of control we talked about earlier. Hypermobility can be generalized because of genetics or localized because of the way we use ourselves. We can create localized hypermobility at our instrument if we don't respect good alignments during play. Maintaining good alignments requires strength. This relationship also works the other way around. We aren't just generally fit. We are fit to some kind of activity or task. Fitness is what allows for apparent effortlessness or ease in the execution of anything. You won't have it from the get-go, you will gain it through training and or practicing. And that will normally involve the conscious tensioning of muscles, at least for a period of your life. Alright guys, I know this was a lot, but here we have thrown the basis of a framework, a set of definitions and principles we will refer back to all the time on this channel to answer all of your questions. If you master these concepts and keep following the videos as they come out, I expect you will be ahead of the curve in terms of understanding not only injury prevention, but also natural and efficient technique. Future videos will focus more on tools you can use to identify and treat hypermobility and lack of control, as I will go through your questions. If you are already in pain though, make sure you consult a health professional before applying any advice. So be sure to like, subscribe, and share this channel with perhaps a friend who has issues in their body at their instrument. And keep putting your questions in the comments below. I'll see you guys next time.